Good morning if you are in the West Coast of the United States, as I am. And good afternoon if you are in the East Coast of the United States, as our discussant, Ohannes Kılıçdağı, is today. And good evening if you are joining us from across the ocean, from Turkey or from the larger region, as our moderator and speaker today are. My name is Baki Tezcan. I teach history at the University of California in Davis, and I'm the convener of the WhatsApp meetings organized by the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. I have a very short presentation about our award here today. Give me 1 second, and then I'll get going, and then I'll pass it on very, very quickly to our moderator. You are all here today to listen to Hülya Delihüseyinoğlu with her presentation entitled Governing Armenian Schools with Ambiguity. This presentation is related to our graduate student paper prize. And the very short presentation I'm doing is just to give you a history of this. The first prize goes back to 1989. At that point in time, the Institute of Turkish Studies, which is no longer extant, created a little funding, which the back then called Turkish Studies Association supplemented and created it, a $200 annual prize. And some of the earliest winners were actually Jane Hathaway. And then in 1991, the prize was named after Sidney Fisher, who used to teach at Ohio State and was one of the earliest Ottoman history professors in the United States. And then some former recipients of the prize are right here on the screen. You can see them and where they went to teach after eventually. And then for this year's prize, that is actually last year's in 2022, the prize committee consisted of the chair, Vladimir Hamid Troyansky, who teaches at University of California, Santa Barbara, and the members were Burcu Karahan and Sarah Fisher. The board liaison was Benjamin Fortner. I'm grateful to all of them for their service. We received a lot of applications, more than in the past, and we were very happy about that. And the committee awarded a prize as well as an honorary mention. And so as a result, we have two presentations in What's Up in Ottoman and Turkish Studies series this year. The winner, Christopher Whitehead, he presented his paper last month. And today you will hear from Hülya Delihüseyinoğlu. The chair of the session, our moderator, is Umut Türem. He is an associate professor at the Atatürk Institute for Modern Turkish History at Boğaziçi University. His research focuses on the political economy of law and regulation, as well as broader questions of law, society, and property, particularly in the context of Turkey. He co-edited a volume entitled The Making of Neoliberal Turkey, came out of Ashgate Routledge in 2016. And his articles appeared in various journals, including Differences, a Journal of Feminist Cultural Studies, and South Atlantic Quarterly. Umut, please go ahead.
Can you hear me now? Thanks for the invitation. Okay, great. I'm really happy to be chairing this event today, and I want to thank you, Baki, and the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association for the organizing. So I just want to briefly introduce our speaker and the discussant. Our speaker today is Hülya Delihüseyinoğlu, whom I worked with at the Atatürk Institute for her PhD. She obtained her BA in Political Science from Boğaziçi University, and then MA from Sabancı University's Conflict Analysis and Resolution Program, and later PhD from Boğaziçi University's Atatürk Institute very recently. Prior to her PhD degree, Hülya worked at the Hrant Dink Foundation for about a year, and spent more than a year at the Cayman Modern Turkish Studies program at the Northwestern University as a pre-doctoral visiting researcher. Hülya's PhD thesis was entitled Armenian Schools in Contemporary Turkey, Governmentality, Community, Resilience. The thesis was a meticulous analysis of the contemporary state of affairs in Armenian schools in Turkey with a strong theoretical background and a solid fieldwork. Hülya asked how these schools both function as a site of discipline by the Turkish state and as a site of governmentality at large, but at the same time how they act as spaces for resilience, community building, and hope for the Armenian community. Hülya has presented or will present parts of her thesis in various academic venues, and the article she will present today also originates from the thesis. And the article to be presented now, as Baki, you mentioned, got an honorable mention at the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association's Graduate Paper Prize. So I'm also looking forward to listening to her presentation today. Let me also briefly introduce our discussant, Ohannes Kılıçdağı. After having double major BA degrees from Sociology and Political Science departments of Boğaziçi University, Ohannes finished his doctoral studies at the Department of History of the same university. Between 2003 and 2017, he lectured at Istanbul Bilgi University's Sociology Department on social and political history of the late Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey. He lectured on the history of Armenians in the late Ottoman and Republican Turkey at various universities of the US and published several articles and reports about the various aspects of this history. Ohannes has been writing a column in Agos, an Istanbul bilingual weekly Armenian newspaper, since 2011. I also want to thank him for being the discussant here and being with us today. So without further ado, I'd like to leave the floor to Hülya Delihüseyinoğlu for her presentation. After the presentation, Ohannes will discuss the paper very briefly, and later on we will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. So Hülya, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's just so great to be acknowledged with honorary mention by the OTSA, and a pleasure to give talk today. So I know in this limited time frame I cannot paint a complete picture describing the context or the overall atmosphere in Turkey. But in order to set the stage, I want to emphasize that as a post-genocide context, Turkey is still not willing to find or encourage the ways to deal with its past. So the habitus of denial is a significant component of the official discourse and the common narrative in Turkey. And it goes without saying that such a climate marginalizes the presence of the Armenian population as an ahistorical representation and veils the public visibility of Armenian social and cultural life. So disconnected from its historical and political existence, even in the best scenario, often Armenians portrayed as a folkloric richness. And the cultural and social ramifications of this climate disrupts our understanding of the deep-rooted history and contextuality of Armenian educational and intellectual life. However, Armenian educational life dates far back. We know that at the incipient stages of the empire, Armenian education connated religious education offered by a few sporadically founded monastery classrooms or by teachers wandering around in the empire. And at the end of the 15th century, with the personal initiative of a priest in Istanbul, religious education started to be offered by irregular local seminaries. As a significant step in communal education with curricula development, a new school structure was introduced in the Armenian educational field in the 18th century. And this period marked the restructuring of Armenian education as irregular instruction left its place to relatively institutionalized education in the seminaries. Along with irregular classrooms for religious education, the number of the Armenian schools increased by the developments of the era. But the actual milestone of Armenian communal education was planted by the education reform of Selim III. In 1789, Selim III granted his non-Muslim subjects the right to establish their own community schools apart from the seminaries. And thereby, with the new educational regulation, the first known official Armenian community school was established in 1790 in the Kumkapı neighborhood of Istanbul. The increasing momentum of the Armenian Renaissance later paved the way for the consolidation of modern institutions. The inner structure and curricula of the schools were progressively altered, and the number of the schools escalated dramatically. After the reform period, the opening of new Armenian schools was swiftly multiplied throughout the empire. And finally, when it came to the beginning of the 20th century, while Armenian schools were incorporated to the Ottoman education system through certain mechanisms of adjustment or audit, their ubiquity in the empire was salient. In 1914, there were around 3,000 Armenian schools and 300,000 Armenian students from every sect in the empire. However, the wreck and ruin of the genocide crippled the Armenian cultural and intellectual life and led the number of schools to plunge dramatically. As looting and usurpation prevailed in Armenian populated settlements, the schools and cultural spaces became open targets. Some of them were shut down, abandoned, and eventually seized by the local population or the Turkish state. Later, with the order of the Interior Ministry, Armenian educational institutions were almost entirely appropriated, which eventually translated into the end of Armenian educational life in those cities. Towards the end of the empire, the status of community schools that could live through the catastrophe of the turn of the century was reduced to minority schools. Their legal status as minority schools was established by the Lausanne Treaty of 1923. However, the confiscation of the school buildings continued during the New Republic. Throughout the years, some of the schools were shut down because of various reasons, because their buildings were burned down or they didn't have enough students to continue education. Today, of these 3,000 schools, there are 16 schools left, and all of them are located in Istanbul. And my PhD research focuses on these 16 Armenian schools. Its objective is to analyze if and how the Armenian schools in contemporary Turkey serve as places of cultural resilience and empowerment, in spite of the political targeting Armenian community experiences today, as well as the constraints of the Turkish education system. It examines the role of the schools in holding the community together in a post-genocide context by maintaining cultural practices and cultural traditions of the past. And the significant contribution of the study is that it employs a broad approach to understand social and cultural aspects impacting the schools, the current atmosphere of the schools, that alter as a response to socioeconomic shifts and changes in relationships, perceptions, and expectations these shifts entail. In that regard, the study does not only describe the schools as vigorous and resilient spaces in which Armenian culture is preserved in variegated ways and occasions, but it unpacks them as a contemporary and transforming compound shaped by the totality of current developments with the impact of the neoliberal shift in the educational realm. It tries to understand the ways the schools balance their priorities in this new social order. So it deals a lot with the question of how power performs at everyday practices in schooling. And it addresses the coexistence of discipline and resistance. Thereby, it analyzes culture from a larger perspective, not as an essentialized identity, but including dilemmas, fragments, priorities in approaching culture. And today I will focus on one part of the study. Let me just share my screen. Here we go. So today, the paper that I'm presenting explains how the Armenian schools are governed in their particular political and social framework. So almost all of the schools referred to in this research and that are open to education today are established during the period of the Ottoman Empire from the 18th century onwards. And the framework of their legal status is based on the Treaty of Lausanne. So the Armenian community preserves their community foundations, churches, and schools that were founded in the empire with reference to the minority rights section in the Lausanne Treaty. And despite certain alterations in their edifice, they maintain the organizational structure introduced in the Ottoman period, which is largely based on pious foundations. And this means that each school is administered within the framework of their pious foundation that takes care of their organizational and financial affairs. The schools are integrated into the Turkish education system and regulated centrally by the Ministry of National Education. So they follow the centrally prepared curriculum with the exception that they can add Armenian language, literature, and theology classes to their curriculum. And with reference to the law and regulation of private educational institutions, community schools are named as private schools. However, they are not for-profit institutions. And their mission is actually to provide free and accessible education for their communities. And by law, only Armenians with Turkish citizenship are eligible for registration to the Armenian schools. And with more than 2,800 students registered in the current education year, and this student population is more or less half of the total student population of the Armenian community today. The schools undertake the responsibility to provide educational needs of Armenians from kindergarten to 12th grade. And at any point of their education, students can switch to the other schools or can be transferred from other schools without any ramification. Here, you can see the full list of the schools as of this current education year with the information on their year of establishment and level of education offered in each school. Of the total 16 schools, 2 of them offer education only at the high school level. 3 of them offer education from preschool to high school, and the rest 11 of them are, from preschool to middle school, and 3 of them are boarding schools. And here you can see the schools on the map of Istanbul. Each red pin represents one school. And the current study deals with the question of how are the Armenian schools and their quotidian practices governed in post-genocide Turkey by a nation state that identifies itself largely by Turco-Islamic tenets. So the research investigates the transformation of the mentality of governance by looking at the particular context of the Armenian schools. And in order to do that, it examines the reconfiguration of the broader educational framework in Turkey and how this framework impacts the Armenian schools. The methodology of this research is interview-based ethnography. I started the field work in November 2018 and completed in December 2019. The ethnographic research took place in 6 schools. In those schools, I attended classes, participated in school events as an observer, spent time in teachers' lounges, and interviewed students, teachers, and school administrators one-to-one or in group settings. To have a complete picture, I also interviewed alumni, parents, board members, journalists, and legal experts working on the particular subject. The duration and format of the interviews changed in accordance with the settings and circumstances of the interviews. And later, I also cross-checked my fieldwork data with laws, regulations, circular letters, or other various legal documents. And I scanned newspaper articles and school websites to enrich the narrative of the study. The limited literature on the minority schools analyzes them with reference to a repressive state, which meticulously controls the functioning of the schools and acts as a coherent system of decision-making. And during the field work with my participants, we talked about various ways of how the Armenian schools experienced sovereign power, equipped with Turco-Islamic precepts. They gave many examples in that regard. For instance, as a result of the state-centric curriculum development and textbook production, textbooks in Turkey, which are distributed to schools by the Ministry of National Education, are the major means of the promotion of Turkish nationalism. The usage of books which are published outside of Turkey are not allowed in schools. The ministry appoints Turkish vice principals to the schools, and until very recently, they were the sole authority in the schools, receiving and signing all official documents. Unlike other contract-based teachers working in the schools, Turkish literature, history, and geography teachers are appointed centrally by the ministry, and their salaries are paid by the ministry. Not until long ago, the schools had to receive permission for every event, theater performance, or show taking place in the schools and send Turkish translations of these events to the Istanbul Directorate of National Education. They had to send Turkish translations of all their exam materials, including their answer keys. And as I said earlier, by law, only Armenians are eligible to register to these schools. Until the regulation issued in 2015, the Ministry of National Education had the authority to decide and certify the eligibility of students for registration. Armenian history cannot be part of the curricula. And before the enactment of the reform package in 2003, the minority foundations were not eligible to acquire landed properties, which had a considerable impact on their capabilities to fund their schools. The legal framework of these conditions hasn't changed, but some of the regulations have been reformed to improve the situation. The school principals and teachers I interviewed remarked that mainly after the 2000s, there have been some minor improvements in the governance of their schools. Some rules are practiced more loosely now or not practiced at all. The ministry sometimes makes occasional goodwill gestures to the schools. Considering these recent developments or oscillations, as I would prefer to say, the analysis that center the state as comprehensive and all-encompassing are not satisfactory enough to grasp the phenomenon. In that sense, I take the edited book, Making Neoliberal Turkey, as a reference point to propose a new analytical perspective. As the post-1980s Turkey underwent a political shift through the neoliberalization process, this neoliberal shift referred to a new political authority and a new form of society. And in order to understand this shift, the conceptual framework of the book offers the incorporation of the dual concepts of neoliberalism and governmentality, in addition to state-centered analysis of Turkish society. So for my subject, instead of analyzing certain improvements as sporadic gestures, we need to see them as patterns if we want to understand the shift in governing Armenian schools. With this perspective, there are certain events setting the stage for the schools that we need to take into consideration. And the first one of them is starting in the 2000s with the emergence of the neoliberalization of education, the lives of students started to revolve around values emanating from the markets. And this situation also resonated with the Armenian schools. Students and parents started to demand the conditions that could provide them the skills meaningful in job markets. And most of the time, this meant waiving Armenian as a language of instruction or decreasing the intensity of Armenian language classes. And secondly, centrally held high school and university entrance exams dominate the classrooms. The exam dynamics compel teachers to fixate on certain topics and methods for central exam preparation. Class hours are entirely devoted to exam topics. With the neoliberalization of education, the state no longer needs to oversee everyday practices in the Armenian schools. The schools embody neoliberal precepts through various means, and power working at the level of practice produces individual subjectivities as apt citizens of the state. The Armenian schools had to relinquish some cultural aspects that they primarily wish to preserve. I can mention here the simplification of materials of Armenian language and literature classes, holding the classes in Turkish instead of Armenian because it's more convenient for the exam preparation, or focusing on competitive skills in extracurricular activities. But visiting the tools of governmentality is not sufficient to comprehend how governing performs in this particular context. So in addition to thinking through the lenses of governmentality, my conceptual framework also builds on these studies that center ambiguity as a tactic of sovereign power. For example, Agamben explains how exceptions constitute a rule of exception. Freytag depicts the government in Syria as intentionally performing vaguely with the purpose of embodying disparate groups. Whedon illustrates that the actual experiences of both domination and resistance cannot be analyzed by the coherence of power, but its ambiguities. While both governmentality and sovereign power apply law as a tactic, Butler asserts that this mechanism works either by employing law in accordance with the interests of the state or suspending it to an instrumentality of the state. And Feldman portrays incapacity and the dynamic of abeyance as a tactic to maintain the rule in Palestine. Sarı and Dinçer as well define the asylum system in Turkey as constituted by ambiguities and uncertainties, as improvisation, unpredictability, and irregularity characterize the system. Yonucu uses the term absent-present law when capturing the contradictions of the rule of law, while she describes it as both functioning and not functioning selectively. And Parla describes uncertainty as an instrument of sovereign power to hold migrants in legal abeyance. And building on the studies, I contend that neoliberalization of education is coupled with legal ambiguity in governing the schools. And what I mean by legal ambiguity in the context of the schools is, in the Turkish domestic law, there is no correspondence of the minority rights section of the Lausanne Treaty. There is no regulation specifically written for the management of the minority schools. So their governing is characterized with unpredictability and irregularity, and they are often subjected to tools of improvisation. Even the officers of the Ministry of National Education are often not familiar with regulations and requirements around the schools because there is no document for reference. And so this situation exposes the schools to the arbitrariness of public officers and authorities. And having an irregular legal status, the minority schools are subjected to the same regulation with private and foreign schools, although they are categorically different from them. That is why they are expected to fulfill standards as their profit-making counterparts, such as quality standards, financial audits, or tax obligations. Although the Armenian schools do not function on a registration fee system and are not for-profit institutions. And there is no umbrella organization that can monitor the problems and needs of the Armenian schools at a larger scale. And they are unregulated. There are various unregulated areas, such as how to register endowments and donations, how to develop curricula in Armenian language, how to train Armenian speaker teachers, how to develop course materials in Armenian, or even how to open a new Armenian school. All these processes require ad hoc solutions. Since there are no Western Armenian language and literature departments in the universities in Turkey, the schools have to develop their own alternative ways in training their Armenian language and literature teachers. And again, because of their status, the schools are not eligible for public services or funds and cannot access the benefits of central capacity development of the ministry. Until 2003, when reform packages were passed in the wake of Turkey's EU integration process, the minority foundations didn't have the right to acquire properties, but only keep properties in their declarations certified in 1936. This is also another example of how legality is instrumentalized to govern minority foundations by confiscation. However, it's a very lengthy subject to explain right now, so I will leave it here. But just to say that with their irregular status, their financial maintenance entirely depends on either revenue coming from their landed properties, if they have, or sporadically given endowments. And for the schools without permanent revenue, this situation creates significant financial uncertainty. And my final slide, to sum up, despite numerous studies that see the state as actively and coherently policing minorities, I see the relationship between the state and the Armenian schools not so straightforward. With the transformation of the mentality of governance in neoliberal age, various forms of governmentality performed by means of the marketization of education. With neoliberalization altered social dynamics in the field of education permanently, disciplinary power governing the Armenian schools has started to work within. On the other hand, the production of the sovereign power cannot be explained anymore with reference to rational calculations. The state governs the Armenian schools by preserving legal ambiguities and instrumentalizing these ambiguities as spaces of maneuver in accordance with its political agenda. So governing the Armenian schools plays out in twofold. The state employs both forces of sovereign power and disciplinary power while governing Armenian schools. Governing through means of legal ambiguity, couples with the technologies of self-government in the domain of education, through ambiguities when necessary and through market values when applicable. That is why instead of a meddling state which controls and rules over every detail regarding the Armenian schools, I describe the Turkish state as a meandering state. The state meanders through sovereign power and disciplinary power, and embraces both of them. Its actions are not so straightforward, but rather meandering with reforms and improvements, although its desire to subdue the minorities perseveres. And by this coexistence, not only does the sovereign power of this meandering state that is historically constructed on a Turco-Islamic synthesis doctrine not entirely surrender, but it also encompasses new forms of governance. And harboring these infinite number of possibilities and unsteadiness in its structure, the Turkish state reshapes itself on different occasions, and yet presents its image as a comprehensive and coherent decision maker. The reiteration of bureaucratic drudgery, quotidian practices, central examination systems, or constant renewal of curricula all collectively produce the state effects and create the perception that as if the state is a coherent separate entity over the society. As ambiguity, unpredictability, and irregularity prevail as the tools in governing the Armenian schools, these means become further instrumental when incorporated into an education system performing with the rules of the market. And this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hülya. Now I think we can switch to Ohannes for the discussion. Floor is yours, Ohannes.
Thank you, Umut. First of all, let me thank Baki Tezcan and OTSA for putting this together and giving me the chance to comment on this very mind-opening paper. And of course, the biggest thank goes to Hülya Delihüseyinoğlu for this insightful research and paper in which she accurately and meticulously describes the situation of Armenian schools in Turkey and the problems these schools face. Although the subject is very lengthy, very complicated with various aspects, let me try to summarize some of my comments on the paper and its claims. As Delihüseyinoğlu also explains, her main concern is to understand how the state governs Armenian schools in Turkey. And in this endeavor, Delihüseyinoğlu underlines two ways of doing this by the state. One is neoliberalization or marketization of education, and the other is creating legal ambiguity. And in relation these two, if you like, dynamics, there is a question going parallel to this discussion, which is to what extent the state directly intervenes the governing of these schools. With respect to this question, I think these two points of the axis, if you like, marketization and ambiguity theories or claims, create an internal tension in the paper, as marketization means less or no state intervention to the governing, whereas creating ambiguity, deliberately, is a deliberate strategy by the state, although it does not require panopticonic control of the schools, but still creating ambiguity is a deliberate strategy by the state. So in other words, the paper informs us how the state has lifted or lessened its direct control over the schools and left the governing to market dynamics, but also it explains mechanisms through which the state continues to keep the situation under control at these schools. Let me mention some quick examples, some of which also mentioned by Delihüseyinoğlu herself. For example, although its strictness has loosened and the schools have been given more say in their appointments in last decade or so, still the teachers of social sciences and Turkish literature and vice principals at these schools are appointed by the state. Or, as another example, the state still restricts who can be registered as students at these schools. Although, again, the authority of the school administrations has been widened related in this issue relatively recently. So it is true that market values and priorities play their role in deterioration of education in and of Armenian language and literature at these schools. Similarly, again, it's true that central examination of university entrance also has downgraded the Armenian language and its formal education at schools. Accordingly, market values and central university exam have pushed some parents to adopt a utilitarian approach and, for example, ask the question, what learning Armenian language and literature is good for? What kind of utility it brings to our kids? So let's lessen the hours of these courses and increase instead the hours of, I don't know, physics or mathematics, etc. So marketization, to cut the long story short, marketization has affected the Armenian schools as it has done education and educational preferences in general in Turkey. However, I would say it doesn't have a central or primary role in the governing of the Armenian schools. I mean, neoliberalization or marketization of education. I mean, first of all, I can mention that there is a synchronization problem between neoliberalization of education in Turkey and some amelioration or betterment at Armenian schools. By the way, I think it's also very debatable to start liberalization of education in Turkey with AKP period. Again, this is a separate debate, which is again complicated and lengthy. But let me say that even before AKP, there had been already more than 20 private universities in Turkey, and even, you know, still I can mention those private educational initiatives, which is called dershane in Turkish, through 1980s and 1990s, where students got additional courses to be successful in university exam. So again, there is a synchronization problem between liberalization of education in Turkey and some betterments at Armenian schools. You know, this betterment, some of tangible and concrete betterments came in 2010s. I don't know, 8-10 years ago at the schools, whereas liberalization of education in Turkey, I think, started much earlier than this. So, as for the issue of ambiguity, it is a sharp and rightful observation to say that the state adopts legal ambiguity as a strategy and tool to govern Armenian schools. And as Delihüseyinoğlu also underlines, it creates, I mean, the state creates not only ambiguity, but also legal inconsistencies and conflicts as a governmental tool. However, if we consider only schools in this matter, we would miss the totality of state strategy as it applies ambiguity and inconsistency in the governance of not only schools, I mean minority schools, but also other minority institutions such as patriarchates or pious foundations, vakıfs. Let me summarize in a sentence this state strategy. I mean, the state either creates a legal vacuum by avoiding promulgation of required laws and regulations for the minority institutions, or whenever it promulgates a law or regulation, it assigns these institutions legal statuses which are inconsistent with their actual identity and function. The example of living legal vacuum is the situation of Armenian Patriarchate today, or other Greek Patriarchate and Jewish Rabbinate. Because until today, the state has not enacted any law, bylaw, or regulation that define the legal status, rights, and responsibilities of the patriarchate. Although, as you know, this is the centennial of Turkish Republic. So the state has deliberately created a legal vacuum and used it as a pressure on the Armenian patriarchate. And this lack of permanent legal regulation includes the patriarchal elections. And because of this, in every occasion, whenever an election is required to be held, the community, Armenian community members got into a chaos and conflict because of this lack of permanent and foreseeable regulation. As another example of creating legal vacuum, let me mention this. The state abrogated the related articles of foundation regulation about elections of boards of these minority foundations in 2013. And until 2020, they had not promulgated any other regulation. So through 9 years, they had blocked the election of board members of minority foundations, and without giving any explanation, any reason. Okay, so of course, this 9-year delay caused very serious problems within the community, which is, of course, I cannot go into details. So as I say, this way they had blocked the elections, this through creating a legal vacuum. As an example of inconsistency between legal status and actual functioning of these institutions, I mean, other than schools, Delihüseyinoğlu already mentioned the schools, I can mention those minority foundations themselves. Although it is a long, again, complicated history, let me briefly mention that in 1926, minority institutions such as churches, schools, orphanages, hospitals, etc., were gathered under the category or umbrella of foundation, although they had not been established and being functioning as foundations in the Ottoman times. Again, I cannot go into technical details, etc., etc. But in 1926, they were given foundation, legally speaking, foundation status arbitrarily. And this conflict, because they don't have foundation charters, etc., etc., because of this conflict, and this conflict has caused many difficulties and material loss for the Armenian community and for other minority communities, especially from mid-1970s on. So, to cut the long story short, despite some ameliorations in the governing of Armenian schools, which are not necessarily consistent with neoliberalization in terms of chronology and content, the state is still there with its ideology, keeping Armenian schools under control. I mean, as indicators of this, I can list many applications or many practices, some of which, again, already mentioned by the author. But again, to repeat some, still there are no courses about Armenian history at Armenian schools. It's not allowed. Still, for even, maybe 7-8 years ago, as a betterment, as a positive step, the state translated some textbooks in, I don't know, in math or other courses into Armenian and distributed these textbooks for free at Armenian schools. But as an example of, I think, ideological intervention, very strangely, they did not allow the usage of Armenian names in these books. they translated books into Armenian from Turkish, but they did not allow to, I don't know, to say Agop, Artin, Tallinn, etc. Instead of that, they said that you should keep Turkish names in the textbooks. I mean, what is the logic here? Is it the market logic here? I don't think so. Or whatever. Still, again, as Delihüseyinoğlu mentions, still no students other than Armenian community members of Turkey is allowed to be registered in the schools. And for example, there are some children in Turkey who were born, I mean, Armenian descent, who were born in Armenia or Syria, but these kids are not allowed to get education at Armenian schools. Again, I think this is also an ideological intervention to the schools, etc. Or I can mention that still these schools are not allowed to hire their own choices of teachers in social sciences. When I say social sciences, I mean history, geography, Turkish language and literature, and also, for example, sociology, which can be you know, a very risky course if you leave it to unknown hands. So again, let me conclude my comments by saying that although marketization affects Armenian education at Armenian schools, I think it's a secondary factor in this governing. And it's true that ambiguity is a tool to govern Armenian schools, but it's not only for schools, it's adopted or practiced, implemented as a general governmental tool to govern Armenian community as a whole, and in that matter, of course, for other non-Muslim communities of Turkey. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ohannes. Now let's give the floor back to Hülya for a brief response, and then we will open up the floor for questions.
Thank you for the comments and for the questions. So I didn't mean that the intention or the presence of the state is not there. It's there because the legal framework, it is still there for the state to intervene, and it keeps the sovereign power and entitlement to control the schools on an everyday basis. And whenever it feels like it intervenes, actually. And that's why at the beginning of my findings, I also underlined that the practices are still there, but sometimes they get more, I don't know, softer, or sometimes depending on the public officer, they can be overlooked, but they're still there. But this perspective to see the schools with reference to the state, or their governance with respect to with reference to the state, is not enough for us to understand what's going on there. So there are lots of different dynamics there, and they need to be taken into consideration to see the whole picture. So that's why, different than before, we need to take into consideration how marketization of education impacts the schools, and how the legal abeyance and legal ambiguity impacts them. And as you say, legal ambiguity is not only practiced in the schools, it as well used as a tactic in other Armenian institutions, in other areas of the legal framework in Turkey. And that's what I try to show actually by presenting my conceptual framework, because there are already studies focusing on asylum system or legal regulations regarding the migrants. So it's the change of the mentality of governance. It's not only a tactic implemented in the schools, but it's more rather general tendency the state uses. And regarding the introduction of the neoliberal education, yes, it goes back to the 1980s, but its impact on the schools, on the Armenian schools, are started to be felt rather more strongly after the 2000s. I am saying this based on my field work, actually, because I talked to the headmasters, the principals of the schools, and they said that they felt the impact more strongly after the 2000s because they had to adjust their teaching methods or their means or employ new ones rather after the 2000s. So it's a gradual process. It's not a like it started 2000 kind of thing, but it's more strong than before after the 2000s because of the introduction of new standards, actually, because as I said, I think I mentioned about this, the performance tests of the teachers and the expectations of students, and now the private educational institutions are shut down. The schools have the responsibility, they take this responsibility to offer extracurricular classes to offer their students after school hours so that they can be prepared for the central examination. Yeah, I think for now, that's all I want to say.
Okay, Hülya, thanks a lot. And once again, thanks to Ohannes for a rich discussion. Now, I'll just say one thing before we go on to question and answer session. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand, and then I'll take note and then give the floor depending on who comes, first come, first serve principle. If somehow you cannot, ask your question by raising your hand, you can also write it to the chat, and then I'll try to read it and then ask your question to our author. Okay, so I see Baki Tezcan's hand up. So Baki Hocam, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hülya, for your presentation. Thank you, Ohannes, for your discussion. I have a lot of questions, actually, but I don't want to take all of the time. If no hands are raised, I'll ask more questions. But the first one, I'm really, I'm curious about so many different things. The subject I know nothing about. The first question I have is, you mentioned, I think at some point, that the number of students who go to these schools, you said 2,800, if I remember correctly, and you said, if I remember correctly, that this is about half of the students who could go, maybe in terms of how many Armenian students there are in that age group, only half of them go to Armenian community schools. So if I understood it correctly, my sort of hypothesis would be more students go in elementary years and maybe less go in high school years. Is that so? And also, do you have a sense of which kind of high schools do they go if they leave these schools? Is it because mainly they get into, let's say, an Anadolu Lisesi, which for our audience here is a public school, but is like a good quality public school. It's like a magnet school or a charter school, not quite charter, but a better, attractive public school. Or maybe they go into private schools that would, private schools or another that would make their chances of getting into college better. Is that what's happening in terms of not all of the Armenian community members' kids going to Armenian community schools, or are there other things at play as well? Is that like how does a family make a choice about which school to send their kids to? Did you do any was there any ethnographic work in that regard with parents that you could reflect on and share with us? Thank you very much.
Can I go and answer this one? Okay. First of all, my ethnographic research was only for the schools, so I don't know anything like of them except them. The number of students registered in this current education year is 2,800, and I said that like the half of the population is goes to the other schools, but it's an estimation that I gathered during my field work. It's an estimation of the teachers, parents, and like the school principals. So it's about the half of the population. And as I talk to the other parents who send their children to private schools, because some of the teachers working in the schools also send their sometimes send their children to the other schools. And by the other schools, I mean almost exclusively private schools, actually. There are only a few examples that I heard who sent their children to Turkish public schools because they think that the English language education in those particular public schools is better than the Armenian school in their neighborhood. But other than that, a few examples, almost exclusively people send their children to private schools if they don't want to send their children to the Armenian schools. And the reason is because they want their children to learn English or other foreign languages in a good way. So if they can afford the private education schools tuition fee, then they do send their children to private institutions. And like teachers even in the schools said that like most of the people who prefer Armenian schools is the parents because they can't afford it. They can't afford to send their children to private schools, or like other reasons, because it's a safer environment and because parents know each other. It's like a family. It's like a safe space. But the language, the English language instruction, or the student clubs, extracurricular activities are mentioned many times actually during my field work. So I think I answered. No? Is it enough?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And about, I'm sorry, I forgot, you asked about the elementary level of the students registered at the elementary level. I don't remember the numbers, but I try to find it. I will like tell you in a minute when I find it, because I already written it somewhere.
Okay, Ayşe Parla said she wanted to ask a question. Ayşe, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you so much. Sorry, I'm on the go, so I wasn't able to figure out the raise hand function on my iPhone. But I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you, Ayşe.
Wonderful, thank you. So first off, I wanted to thank Hülya for a really terrific presentation, and also Ohannes for some critical steering interventions. I really appreciated the back and forth there. And my question, Hülya, is about most broadly positionality. I can already get a sense of how carefully you tread on this, difficult ground of doing field work in a setting where I'm sure you thought really hard about not compromising potentially vulnerable interlocutors. So I'd be really curious to hear a little bit about the kinds of paths that you took in navigating this balance between simultaneously exposing important aspects and impediments, but at the same time protecting potentially vulnerable interlocutors. Thank you.
Thank you for asking this, because it was very stressful for me actually, and it took so much of my time to write down, because It's a very, I don't know, psychologically challenging process for me. So what I did is, actually, I started my fieldwork with a pilot study. And with this, during this pilot study, I contacted my close friends and family members, and then I get first-hand information from them and how to, I don't know, cover this and how to start actually this field work. And during my field work, I didn't record anything. I didn't take voice record or any visual records, or didn't ask people to sign any, I don't know, paper, any document. So their names are nowhere. So it's very confidential in that sense. And I didn't even write the names of the people on my notebook. So that's why it was more, I don't know, candid, I would say, my interviews. And other than that, of course, I mean, my first priority is to not to create stress in the environments I entered, because I know I'm a guest there. They welcomed me. So the feeling that if I misunderstand something, if I mispresent something, how I'm gonna deal with this kind of thinking, it actually gave me a lot of stress. So that's why I was very meticulous about this process. I didn't write every example or every case that I saw. And I make other people read my drafts. So I don't know how actually, I didn't have a strategy at the beginning, but I just I think improvise along the way. So that's why probably it was more stressful for me. But the fact that I didn't record anything or didn't ask any recording from the people that I talked to made me feel a lot better. But the fact that I mean, what if I can't present or say all the things that I learned in a correct or accurate way? It's actually still gives me stress. So that's why I can't really answer this question.
Thank you so much.
Okay, now I have in line Diana Hayrapetyan and then Funda Soysal.
Thank you so much. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. And my question is about what are the responses of the Armenian schools to this policy by the Turkish state? Are they silent recipients of the those policy, or this legal ambiguity and dual standards allow them a wider scope to navigate and become more attractive to Armenians in Istanbul to send their children to the Armenian schools? Thank you. So the question is about what are the responses of Armenian schools to these policies?
So this ambiguity also time to time allow people to maneuver in this vacuum actually. So they can, since it's not a really strict, it's a strict legal framework, but since it works in a more ambiguous way, people also improvise the conditions that they are working with. For example, Ohannes gave an example of how Syrian or people from Armenia, when they come to Turkey and want to register the schools, cannot be registered in the schools because the schools are specifically for the people with Turkish citizenship. But schools actually accept students from Armenia. They audit the classes. They can't get any certificate of graduation, but they can sit in the classrooms, follow the class. And at the end, in the last year of their education, they switch to a Turkish public school, and they get their graduate certificate of graduation. So, and like, for example, in one of the schools, so registration also requires a number of the Turkish ID. And since people like migrants don't have this ID and this number, they can't be, I mean, you can't even try to register them because they don't have this number. But one of the principals that I talked to, she said that one of her students get a temporary ID, and there was a number, and she tried to enter that number to register the students, and she could because she had the number, and she just like fill out the form on the registration system, and she did. But then after that, an officer from the Ministry of National Education came and interrogated her because, I mean, it's prohibited to register a student with another citizenship. She like had to deal with this all legal process. At the end, they removed the registration of the student. But like, what I'm trying to say is like, sometimes people try to push because, I mean, if it's a number, there's the number, let's try kind of thing. It doesn't work, but as in the example, like students auditing the class, like sit in the classrooms, it works. So they can follow the classes at least in an Armenian school.
Thank you.
Funda Soysal.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very insightful talk. Yeah, my question is, were you able to interview the vice principals or anyone from the Turkish bureaucracy about this research? Thank you.
Yes, I also talked to vice principals and Turkish teachers, history and literature. And not in this paper, but in other chapter, I also talk how they act in their classrooms, and how they perceive the situation, and how they develop certain mechanisms to work there, why they are working there, why they prefer to be appointed by the ministry, kind of things. Yes, I did. I researched.
So do they have an explanation about this ambiguity themselves?
No, not really, no. Because like they are not very, you mean the vice principals? They just mentioned that like earlier years, like, I don't know, 20, 15 years ago, they were the authority to, as I mentioned, like signing the documents, contacting the ministry on every occasion because they were the responsible party. And not anymore. They say that we don't like intervene in the administrative stuff. We just like leave this kind of work to the headmaster, to the principal. So we are not as active, let's say. We are not as intervening as before. And some of the actually principals also mentioned this. They said that like now the vice principals are not dealing this kind of documents, or like, I don't know, they probably do. They don't say maybe, or principal doesn't know about it, but they say that they're not as intervening as before in comparison to 10, 15 years ago.
Thank you.
Okay, now we have in line Aret Özkan.
Okay, hi. Also about a question on the vice principals appointed by the Ministry of Education. If we go back in time, when do we start seeing this position getting established in the minority schools? Is it with the Republic, or maybe a little later time with the changing of environments, political environment? And also, having a vice principal in minority schools, is this based on a set rule, or based on an unwritten rule, but imposed on minority schools? So that's the question. And as an interesting detail, I just want to add, our vice principal at school, at high school, he would call himself head vice principal, even though we didn't have any other vice principals, and he would handwrite head next to his title on official documents, I guess just to emphasize his point. Thanks.
Thank you. The position is introduced actually during the Ottoman period. I think the definition of the role changed throughout time, but it was there before the Republic. And but like at the beginning of the Republic, the role given to these vice principals was expanded. What was the other question? I'm sorry, I forgot.
Is it based on a written regulation, or it's an unwritten rule?
No, it's a written regulation. As I mentioned, like the Armenian schools are regulated by the law and regulation of private and foreign educational institutions, and it's written there that a vice principal should be appointed. And also there is another law regulating the appointment process of Turkish culture teachers and Turkish vice principals to these schools.
Thank you.
And Baki Tezcan.
Since there were no other hands or no questions on the chat, I'm going to ask another one of my questions. Hülya, I'm really curious about the curriculum. You mentioned that they cannot teach Armenian history. And then there are a lot of teachers that are actually appointed by the National Ministry of Education who get their salary from the National Ministry of Education. I guess they are for regular social science courses and maybe also regular science courses. I'm wondering if, let's say, there are 40 hours of instruction that is not necessarily hours, but 40 classroom hours. How much of it happens actually in Armenian and how much of it actually happens in Turkish? I'm curious about this because I went to a school where one of these Anadolu liseleri, where the medium of instruction was in German, and over there it was about 50-50. We had German and all of the sciences in German language, and then everything else in Turkish, and the ratio was 50-50. How much Armenian language course instruction actually happens? Do students get really full proficiency? And a related question, if a student enters these schools from elementary level, but let's say the parents didn't speak with the student in Armenian at home, how do they manage bringing all the students to the same level in Armenian? Is there like, do they do, I don't know, preparatory class? Do they manage it by sort of differentiating levels? How do they manage pedagogy? Because it looks like there is no real Armenian teacher education that the state allows. So a lot of things must be happening within these schools. So they must also spend a lot of time and energy to figure out pedagogy. Did you get a sense of that? Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking this, because I didn't have time to explain it. So the appointed teachers are only Turkish culture teachers, meaning Turkish literature, Turkish history, geography, and social science teachers. Social science, like more like, I don't know, history, not literature, but history kind of class. Other teachers, like the rest, are on contract base. They are hired by the school individually, by its foundation, and their salaries are paid by the foundation. So only the salaries of Turkish culture, history, geography, social science teachers are paid by the ministry. Other than that, it's responsibility of the school. And the curriculum is like, as you said, that here's the thing. In every level, the hour of the Turkish language classes changes. Like, for example, on the 9th grade, it's, let's say, 8 hours. If there's an 8 hours of Turkish language class, then the school can add to its curriculum 8 hours of Armenian language class. So it has to match. And the content of the Armenian language class should match the Turkish language class. So it's about the same syllabi. It has to be the same syllabi. And that's why Armenian language teachers or literature teachers have to translate the Turkish language curriculum to Armenian, have to prepare their materials pedagogically equivalent of that Turkish language class. And but sometimes some schools do not prefer to have the number of the hours of the Armenian language class, because I think that it's very overwhelming for the students. If there's an 8 hours of Turkish language class, the school might prefer to have 4 hours of Armenian language class, and they think that I mean, they do this because otherwise the total hours of class in a week will be too much for the students. And the students at some points, like at the, I don't know, on their senior year, want to focus on the central exam preparation. So they don't want to burden the student with extra hours of Armenian language class, because they think that it doesn't mean anything in the central examination. And for the students whose parents don't talk at home, or there are also students who come from Anatolia, from Anatolian families, whose families like live there, but the families send their children to boarding schools. And in those cases, sometimes the family of the student doesn't prefer to send their children when they are really young. So sometimes they send their children after the 4th grade. And which means that when the student comes, they don't know any Armenian if the family doesn't know. And in those cases, Armenian language teachers give those students extracurricular Armenian language classes so that they can like catch up with the rest of the classroom. But some cases it's not possible, or I don't know, it's not quick enough. Then they have to adjust the contents or the competency, not the competency, they adjust the content or the proficiency of their materials according to the newcoming students. So sometimes they simplify the content so that the newcoming student can also join the discussion in the classroom.
So
Thank you.
I'm sorry. There are 2 questions, one in the chat. I think it's a straightforward question, and then there is Huri Berberian. I'll read out loud the question in the chat. It's asked by Namık Erkal. What are the options of Armenian high school graduates? Are their diplomas accepted internationally? Perhaps you can answer this briefly, Hülya, and then we can have the Huri Berberian's question.
Yes, I mean, they can go to any university in Turkey, and it's internationally accepted because these schools are integrated to the Turkish education system. So they are recognized by the Ministry of National Education. So every right a student has in other school, they also have this right. They can go to another school, they can switch their Turkish public school to a private school, go to university, and then or from the public school they can come to an Armenian school. There is no, ramification or problem with that.
Huri.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Hülya, for this great work. I really look forward to seeing it published. I have a question that you may or may not be able to answer, but maybe it's more of a comment as well. Have you looked at the situation in Iran in terms of Armenian schools? Because they have a very similar history. On the other hand, it's a very different history.
pre-genocide and post-genocide as well. So I just wanted to invite you to do that if you haven't done that, because I think it would be a good comparative glance at these two developments.
Thank you, but no, I haven't. This was exclusively on the about the schools in Turkey, and I also know that in the schools in Beirut, they also have a different way of like functioning, because like Armenian is a very well part of the like the everyday conversations in classrooms. And I'm sorry, I forgot to tell, because Barkojo also asked how much people talk during the classes. I forgot to mention about it. So like there are, like most of the time, the classes are taught in Turkish. Only 2 schools, they focus on holding the classes in Armenian. But other than that, mostly all, I mean, by all, I mean the classes except Armenian language, literature, or theology classes, they are taught in Turkish. But in the elementary schools, in kindergarten or most of the time to the 4th grade, the schools focus on teaching the material in Armenian. But after the 4th grade, when the time gets closer to central examinations, because like at the end of the 8th grade, they take a central examination to enter high schools, and in the high school, on the 11th and 12th grade, students focus on central examination to enter universities. So during those grades, the classes switch fully Turkish.
Baki?
Because I don't see any hands, I'm going to ask my next question. I'm really sorry, I keep asking, but this is a subject I know nothing about, and it's fascinating. So you said they cannot charge tuition, and they're having a very difficult time registering property to have foundation income kind of thing, but yet they have to pay the salary of all these teachers themselves. So then do they go to the Armenian community and ask for donations? How do they do the fundraising aspect of this? This is, I mean, I'm thinking that there is kind of a problem here in the sense that if they're not able to ask for fees, why doesn't the government support them a bit more with teaching? It's like, it's a very, this ambiguity thing that must be very, very difficult for the community. So how do they handle the finances of this is one question. And then a related question, but maybe Hülya, it's not quite for you, because I don't want to put you on the spot, is perhaps Ohannes could tell us. Ohannes mentioned something about these schools were not foundation schools at the time they were originally established, and then they were put into that category later. So I'm curious, in Ottoman era, what exactly was the status? Was the Ottoman government actually supporting them financially then? What kind of legal category did they have then? Ohannes didn't get into this, just mentioned it in his comments, but I'm really curious, and Ohannes is here, so maybe he could jump in. All right, thank you.
Actually, in the Lausanne Treaty, it says that the schools should get funds from the center to cover their expenses, but in practice, it doesn't work like that. I mean, the schools cannot get any funding from the central government, although sometimes like parliament members reminds that the schools also should get funding from the center. It was never accepted, so they can't get any funding from the center. And in order to cover their expenses, those foundations who already have landed properties use their revenues to cover the expenses of the schools. And the schools cannot ask for a registration fee, but they ask for endowments from the parents. So if a parent can pay a small amount, they ask the parent to do that. And in addition to that, they also have fundraising events every year. So they ask the community members to like dine with the teachers and the school administrators and to raise some money for the expenses of the school. And also they ask endowments from philanthropists in the community. But of course, I mean, this causes some problems because it gets very unpredictable. So it's, I mean, the financial security of the school becomes dependent on individual person's intention or goodwill to give some endowments. So it's not a very desirable situation. And now also the pious foundations can register their landed properties because the legal framework has changed. So they can even get their donations and then get a donation as a landed property and register that. And some of the schools also open court cases to reclaim their properties which were confiscated before.
Thank you. Thank you so much. A related question, has there been any attempt to go to the European Court of Human Rights or something like that on the basis of equality for the right of education? Because, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but if Lausanne Treaty says that the central government should be paying and the central government is not paying, then an Armenian Turkish citizen is discriminated against versus a Turkish, ethnically Turkish citizen in schools because the school funds, I mean, everybody pays taxes, but the taxes support the, so there is, probably you could make a discrimination case out of it. Has that attempt been tried? Because maybe that could push things a little bit.
I talked to lawyers, but none of them mentioned about this, and I didn't run into a case like this. But I know that in 1999, with the legal process, with the legal path to open and to send individual petition to European Court of Human Rights, they open court cases to reclaim their properties by claiming that we exhausted the domestic means and couldn't get our properties back. So that's why we give an individual petition to the European Court. And then that's actually how they got back their some of the properties. Yeah, but I don't know any case as you mentioned. Maybe Ohannes know, but I didn't run into something like that.
No, me neither. I mean, I don't remember any case, I mean, going to European Court related to educational rights. But as Hülya says, there are other cases related to properties. But as far as I know, no case about this educational rights or discrimination on the educational ground. Coming to your question, Baki, although I mean, again, it's a very legally speaking, very complicated issue, but you know, in Ottoman time, these institutions, I mean, schools, churches, and other things are established through irades, sultanic irades, or if you like, they got an administrative permit to found these institutions, schools, etc., churches, and from a transfer to republic, and during this transition to republican time, the state couldn't decide to which category to put all these institutions. And although I don't remember the name now, a legal expert from Switzerland, when invited to Turkey and prepare for civil law. In the civil law in 1926, they decided to put under the category of pious foundations. But again, this caused many, in coming decades, many complications because these institutions lack many of legal and practical characteristics of foundations. Just to say one, for example, they do not have charters, vakıf senedi, charters, since they were not established as vakıfs, naturally, they do not have foundational charters, but later at courts, this was used to their disadvantage, again, to cut the long story short, to extort their properties, etc. Again, from 1970s on, not only properties belonging not only to Armenian communities, but other minority communities have been extorted, but only in early 20,000s, some of these properties were returned through some legal regulations, again, as a part of that amelioration in early 2000s.
Thank you.
Sure.
There is one more question in the chat, and maybe we can wrap up with this question, and then I'll try to add my little comment actually after this question. So Cansu Oğuz asks, I'm interested in understanding how the topic of the Armenian genocide is taught to pupils when the history curriculum is decided by the state and delivered by state-appointed teachers. Could you provide any insights on the approaches used to educate pupils about the genocide in the schools? So my brief addition to this question is that, so Hülya, there's this sort of constant actually push to you to talk a little bit more about the everyday life in the schools, when in fact, the question of legal ambiguity and the state are like much more institutional and much more like quote unquote, political stuff. Whereas, I hear that various questions actually ask you to reflect on the everyday of the school and school life and, students and teachers and all that. So perhaps my little comment / question is you to reflect on how actually this sort of institutional realm is connected with the everyday realm, so to speak, the institutional question of legal ambiguity and the state and all that connects with the everyday of the schools in the Armenian school context. So I'll stop there.
Teaching Armenian genocide is not part of the curriculum, so that's one of the problems, because the curriculum is prepared centrally by the ministry, so it's based on a denial actually. But in practice, how it works is just like it's usually teachers and students, I would say, they have like a silent pact. So the teacher doesn't want to talk about it because they know that it's represented and narrated in an inaccurate way. So they pass or cover the topic as quickly as possible and move on with the next topic. And sometimes they just like tell the teachers, what happened, so and then like be done with the topic. So yeah, I guess like it creates a lot of resentment in the classroom because like students want to talk about it. But the emotional, the affect side of it, I don't know. I mean, it's a subject of another research. And the question of how legal ambiguity reflects or performs in everyday life is I think I didn't understand the question, I guess, so I'm not sure how to answer it.
So it wasn't a well-formulated question, but I was suggesting that, you know, speaking about legal ambiguity and the state usually is more about, you know, policies and the state as an institution and whatnot, whereas school as a living organism and how this like major political sort of institutional stuff is experienced on the ground is another story, right? Like, so these are two different levels. And I thought actually almost all the questions actually sort of ask you to speak about the connection between these two levels, and that I thought was an interesting interesting issue to think about when perhaps you focus on your new research and whatnot. So it was more like a comment rather than a question.
So this paper is actually like in this paper, I talk about how the governance takes place, but like it's a dissertation project. And in other chapters, I try to reflect how actually this everyday practices are like, how everyday practices play out and how as a space actually the Armenian schools perform work and what kind of an environment it creates for the students and teachers, and it's like a very vibrant space. And when people ask the resistance resilience part of the research, so it's another subject that I focus separately in the dissertation, and it's a place of resistance because it's a safe space and it's a unique place, and for its constituents, it transforms and works on everyday basis. So it's not only about the legality, the governance. So it's empowering. It works in an empowering space, and it improvises as it goes.
All right, thank you, Hülya. It's been a very sort of rich discussion, and I want to thank you first for this, you know, great presentation and then question and answer session. And once again, very many thanks to Ohannes for the discussion and Baki for organizing the event. And perhaps we can now wrap up and say goodbye if you don't have anything else to add, Baki Hocam.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
I actually forgot one question.
Please.
You asked the student numbers in this current education year and whether the student number at the preschool level is higher or lower. So I want to just like let you know that 500 students registered at the preschool level, 900 at the primary.
Hülya froze, I think.
Yeah, Hülya's Wi-Fi connection just got cut after the 900 in the 1 through 4th grades, I guess. Well, thank you again. Thank you so much. Oh, Hülya is back. Okay, Hülya, we couldn't hear after 900 in the, I guess.
Sorry. 900 at the primary school, 800 at the middle school, and 600 at the high school level. So considering the number of levels, I would say more or less equally distributed.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your work. This is, you know, being an Armenian in Turkey is difficult, very, very difficult, and you showed it to us with your work. And I imagine studying this subject in Turkey is also difficult. So I really appreciate the work. And Ohannes, thank you so much for your commentary. Umut Hocam, thank you so much for chairing the session and you know, advising students like Hülya. And however, I cannot help but say, even though this situation is so difficult, what we didn't touch on at all, because it is not part of the topic, obviously, but if you were a Kurdish citizen of Turkey, you couldn't learn any Kurdish in any school, pretty much, although there actually was some move in that direction to sort of introduce Kurdish as a language that you could pick as a foreign language in elementary in junior high and high schools. It didn't really continue. There is only one department in a university where you can learn Kurdish literature, and it is in Mardin. And so this is just to say that being non-Turkish in Turkey in general is quite difficult. But this story, even though there is actually law, and Lausanne Treaty tells that the government has to pay, that they are not doing that, that is pretty outrageous. Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing all of this to our attention. And hopefully I'll see some of you at another event soon. Next month, we will have a WhatsApp meeting. I didn't get a chance to schedule it yet, but you will hear from me over email. Thank you. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.